We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity.
Years ago, there was a book written by William Cooper called Behold a Pale Horse. And in Behold a Pale Horse, there's a chapter called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. And basically what I'm saying is that silent weapons are weapons that don't make any noise, but definitely have an effect on the population of a people. Meaning, I believe the group is called the Club of Rome or the Committee of 300. It's one or the other. And they had decided traditional warfare wasn't any good anymore. And when they decided this, it was after World War II. And I'm bringing it up because obviously, according to Norman Dodd, they hadn't decided to change that for a little while still, until after World War II. Now, we still have warfare. That's evident. But one of the things that was written on the Georgia Guidestones is no more war. And also, recently, I've read across a few things that have said that the elite of the world have decided that nuclear war isn't a good idea. And I believe the reason they decided that is because they understand that they would kill themselves. Why would you do that? You know, I mean, traditional warfare, most of the people who run the country, they end up living. Unless you're like, I don't know, what, Taliban? Taliban, I mean, they control a couple areas over there in the Middle East, but nothing major. You know, you kill a few of those folk, and next thing you know, you have a whole new government. But most governments survive war. They make a few treaties, and everybody continues on. But go check out Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, the chapter in Behold a Pale Horse.
So then, in 1909, they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department.
You want control of the State Department to control the narrative. You can put your agents in there to go talk to the leaders and representatives of other countries. Simply so you can work on their mind before anybody else can. And then the State Department reports directly to the president. So now your aim is now to get the president to listen to you. And then why would you lie to the president? We're all in this together, right? We all have the same goals in mind, right? Peace, freedom, and equality. Well, I mean, I don't think they have those goals in mind, but that's the method of their operation, is to control the narrative.
And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes, and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time, they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration of the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assembled 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence, a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency.
I'm going to give the definition here for collectivism. Collectivism, though, basically is just when the individual gives up his rights for the good of the whole. There isn't a bigger duty that an individual recognizes as his highest sense of morality as giving up his individual rights for the good of the whole. But here we go. Collectivism. And they have several types of social organization in which the individual is seen as being subordinate to a social collectivity, such as a state, a nation, a race, or a social class. Collectivism may be contrasted with individualism, in which the rights and interests of the individual are emphasized. And then down here a little further, it says collectivism has varying degrees of expression in the 20th century in such movements as socialism, communism, and fascism, meaning they're all pretty much the same. There are some gray areas or some areas in which you're crossing over from one into the other, but socialism, communism, fascism, liberalism, it's all the same garbage in the end. And down here it also says that it deals sometimes with a redistribution of income and varying degrees of planning and public ownership. Right now there's a big movement in the Agenda 23 movement or Agenda 21 for all these public-private ownership contracts. I'll cover more of that later, though. Public-private ownership, which means nobody really is owning it. The public owns it. It's like a private deal, but the public really isn't the one negotiating the deals. The government is doing these things on behalf of the public. Public-private ownerships. Look it up.
That's the story that ultimately grew out of, and of course was what could have been presented by the members of this congressional committee to the Congress as a whole for just exactly what it said. But they never got to that point.
This is the story that emerged from the minutes of the Carnegie Fund.
That's right.
Carnegie Endowment
That's
Fund.
right.
And so...
It was official to that extent.
I see. And Catherine Casey brought all of these back in the form of dictated notes or verbatim readings of the minutes.
On dictaphone belts.
Are those in existence today?
I don't know. But if they are, they're somewhere in the archives under the control of the Congress, House of Representatives.
How many people actually heard those, or were they typed up transcripts made of them? How many people actually heard those recordings?
Oh, 3 maybe. Myself, my top assistants, and Catherine. Yeah, I might tell you this experience as far as its impact on Catherine Casey was concerned was she never was able to return to her law practice. If it hadn't been for Carol Reese's ability to tuck her away on a job with the Federal Trade Commission, I don't know what would have happened to Catherine. But ultimately, she lost her mind as a result of it. Terrible shock to her. It's a very rough experience to encounter proof of these kinds.
Catherine Casey pretty much had her worldview shattered because she held the men running foundations and their ideals in such high regard that when she saw what they were doing, she just couldn't cope with it. This is something that when you're a fanatic of something, that's what happens to you. Because you're really holding these people to such high standards that they really can't live up to. Whatever your standards are for them, they're probably just not going to live up to them. And you're going to have your world shattered when you worship people and then find out that they're not really anything like you thought they were. It was basically idolatry. And what this also tells me is that Casey didn't have her mind on the things of the Lord, because the reality of God is meant to help keep you sane. She didn't believe in the Lord, or she would have been able to maintain her sanity. Sad, but true. Don't be a fanatic of people. Don't hold people in such high worship that they're like idols to you, that they're godly to you. Because when they disappoint you, you're not going to have anywhere to run to. But if you put all your faith and your beliefs in God, of the Holy Bible, you'll be good.